All right, folks, let's get started. It's great to have you here today at this webinar as a part of the Peace Primers for Peace at COP28 series. The series was developed and hosted by a community of practice on environment, climate, conflict, and peace, hosted by the Geneva Peacebuilding platform, but really ranging across the world. The community of practice has more than 800 members. And within it, there is an interest group looking at peace at COP28. I'll paste a little info blurb in the chat if you're interested in learning more and attending other webinars. We're hosting a series running between the International Day of Peace in mid-September up to COP28, exploring different subtopics related to peace and conflict sensitivity. And we've heard quite a lot from different policymakers, program designers, program managers, that they're increasingly called upon to sort of expand conflict-sensitive climate action funding and finance without necessarily knowing what the evidence base is. And so this is probably the installment, don't tell anyone else, although this is being recorded, that I'm most excited about within this series, which is a sort of tour of the evidence base. We have two brilliant experts here who are going to share a little bit of what we know and then discuss where some of the gaps are. I also just want to name that there may be some pieces that they identify as a gap that you actually know already exist. Please put that in the chat. We'd love for this to be a conversation. So if you're aware of what we're not aware of, then make it known. It's always hard to know what is where. So I just want to sort of name that from the outset, that we'd love that sort of conversational orientation. So without much further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Amanda and Leo, who will introduce themselves, coming at us from the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and their interest group on monitoring and evaluation. Amanda, I think over to you, and I will share the screen.
Thanks, Annika. It's great to see everyone. I see some familiar faces, or at least names right now. But as Annika said, I hope when we get to the discussion portion, people will feel comfortable putting on their cameras. So as Annika mentioned, today we're going to talk about where is the evidence, looking at existing research and opportunities on climate, peace, and security. I'm Amanda Woomer. I am a member of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and the co-chair of the M&E interest group. And if that's something you're interested in, I really encourage you to join. We're actually restarting the interest group this year, looking forward to the conference next year and being part of the Path to The Hague. And I'm also a senior consultant with Oxford Policy Management's Climate Resilience and Sustainability team. And before I pass it to Leo, who's going to introduce himself and jump in, I just want to go over the agenda on the next slide. So we're going to talk about what's the existing evidence is in climate security, climate adaptation, and climate finance. We're going to identify some of the gaps and challenges that we've seen in those spaces. And then we're hoping we'll have a robust conversation. We have some guiding questions, but as Annika said, this is really about sharing what we know, but also you sharing what you know, so that we're all a little bit better informed about where the evidence is and where it's not in this space. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Leo, and for an introduction and to get us started. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, everyone. First of all, thank you all for joining and for your interest on this topic. And of course, big thanks to the Geneva Peacebuilding platform and their community of practice on environment, climate, conflict, and peace for convening this session. My name is Leonardo Medina, but yeah, everyone calls me Leo. I am a climate security specialist with CGIAR Focus Climate Security and a member of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and of the Working Group on Monitoring and Evaluation. Today, I will provide just a very brief introduction to the state of evidence regarding the linkages between the impacts of climate change and the risk of conflict and societal instability. We may go to the next slide, please, Amanda. Okay, so the climate security field, just to provide a very brief introduction to the field, began as a result of a shifting pattern in the way that armed conflict takes place around the world, around 6 or 7 decades ago, actually. So as you can see in this graph, the number of intrastate conflicts or civil wars has particularly increased in the last 50 years or so. They have actually constituted the vast majority of conflicts around the world. Now, around the time that the Cold War was ending, this trend began sort of to challenge some of the more traditional and state-centric understandings of security. And so it led to the field expanding its understanding of peace, of conflict, to integrating what it's called sort of like soft understandings of security. Among these soft, I won't define the term because it's quite broad, but security is also understood as access to a stable environment and to the availability of natural resources in which especially rural populations rely, right? And so this kind of thing started being considered as increasingly relevant to understand conflict dynamics. As such, under the context in which we're seeing increasingly clear or evident impacts of climate change and increasing vulnerabilities to climate change all across the world, we are defining climate security risks as risks that emerge through interactions between ecological, social, political, and economic dimensions, and that are driven by one or more climatic stressors that directly or indirectly, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on that, challenge the peace and stability of states and societies. Next slide, please. Now, the recognition of these risks, of climate-related security risks, it helped elevate climate change in national and international security agendas. I won't go into detail here, but I just want you to see that since 2007, when the UN Security Council discussed for the first time the concept of climate security and the challenges that it poses globally, the term has become increasingly relevant in international policy and governance, both for climate and peace-building action around the world. Next slide, please. I'm going to focus my presentation today in basically three research questions or two research agendas that the climate security field focuses on. The first, and it's the one that actually gave birth to the field, it tries to understand what is the influence of climate effects, right? Usually focusing on specific disasters over the dynamics of conflict, both the onset and ongoing armed conflict. The second question, it takes a broader view and already integrates some concepts of the soft security framework that I discussed. It looks at how the effects of climate variability and extremes pose different types of risks to societal stability at a global, national, or subnational levels, right? And the third research question takes even a broader view, right, and explores what I like referring to as the human dimensions of climate security. It basically explores how people themselves experience the overlapping risk of climate and conflict. So this agenda does not necessarily intend to define a causality or a contribution between climate and the onset of conflict, but rather just asks how people actually live through these risks when they are together, right? And when they are somehow interrelated in complex manners. Next slide, please. So to start with the armed conflict research question, this is one of the main research questions, right? And it's actually the one that takes the most of the literature there, or the most of research focuses. Most of the studies are actually focused on this research question, and most of them have actually done so through quantitative analysis. Around 60% of peer-reviewed articles are quantitative, right? And the majority of them are focused on this specific relation between armed conflict and the effects of climate change, or actually the other way around, between climate change and the onset or increasing intensity of armed conflict. Now, next slide, please. So during the last decades, numerous studies have tried to investigate whether climate change impacts can be sort of correlated with conflict-related outcomes, right? So if we purely based our analysis on the overlay of these two things, right? Actually, I made a mistake. Can you go before to the previous slide, Amanda? I'm sorry about that. So I want you to see these two maps, because if we see the global distribution of armed conflict and climate vulnerability, we can very easily conclude like, yeah, okay, there is a direct correlation there, or actually this happens at the same time, right? And there's a very big amount of quantitative large N methods that actually try to understand this relation. These are usually focused on Africa and the Middle East, as you can see here, right? These studies, they try to establish a direct link between climate change and violent conflict, right? Next slide, please. However, when trying to do so, these studies have tended to sort of produce a variety of very often conflicting evidence, right? And so if we see the studies for the last 20 years that have been conducted, particularly when looking at the statistical studies or quantitative, we see that 48, they found a direct linkage, or not direct, but a linkage on influence of climate change over conflict. 28 produced mixed results, meaning sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down, both of them, right? It's not clear. And 24% found no link whatsoever. So this is very hard to theorize, and it points to these linkages in many different directions, sometimes very contradictory. These studies, by the way, they are about the onset of conflict, right? And so the emergence of more violence, right? If you go to the next slide, please. Another big set of studies, they have been about how the climate effects influence ongoing conflict, right? And so whether they drive the escalation of conflict or de-escalation of conflict, have no effect whatsoever. And I'm building here particularly on Tobias Ides' very recent publication on the analysis of 36 civil wars through a mixed methods approach. So this goes beyond quantitative methods only, in which he assesses what is the influence of disasters over the ongoing civil wars or intrastate armed conflict, right? And he basically found that in 25% of cases, there is an escalation of conflict, 25% there is a de-escalation, so disasters actually reduce the amount of violence, and in 50% there is just no effect whatsoever. Usually this effect is the result of strategic effects. So disasters may undermine the capacity of states to actually engage in violence against armed groups, or may provide an opportunity for armed groups to actually create engage in battle, right? So this is the escalation question. This is the main channel through which this correlation takes place. On the other hand, the de-escalation takes place because disasters may pose constraints to armed group to actually mobilize, right? Because there is no roads, because there is no infrastructure, and so they don't have the opportunity to actually engage in violence. So it's a very sort of like pragmatic way in which disasters actually influence conflict. A second, less relevant form in which disasters de-escalate conflict is because government responses to disaster actually increase the dependence of peoples over government, and that decreases the risk of recruitment, right, or support towards armed groups. This actually, it's important because research almost never accounts for the possibility of conflict de-escalation because of disaster. So this is a particularly relevant and comprehensive study to present, and that's why I made such an emphasis on it. Next slide, please. So what are the key takeaways here? Research should be cautious regarding narratives of conflict escalation due to the effects of climate change. In fact, the IPCC in its 5th report already said, collectively, the research does not conclude that there is a strong positive relation between warming and armed conflict, while in its 4th assessment report, it had actually made the assessment that there may very well be a link between armed conflict, so between climate and armed conflict. So we're sort of like starting to adjust our narrative here. And especially the other big thing is that, yes, there is an important relation between the occurrence of disaster in context of fragility, but especially context matters, right? So we need to really look at what is going on in every location to really understand what is the way in which climate may be relevant. Next slide, please. So to go to the second research question, right? This is the second school of climate security that emphasizes that climate change does not in itself cause violent conflict, but rather affects underlying factors, right? And so that sometimes generate either conflict or other forms of societal instability, such as political protest, crime, intercommunity conflicts, migration, right, among others. So this literature highlights that there is a critical role of fragility risks in mediating this relationship, particularly the role of inequality, historical grievances, and illegitimate or ineffective governance institutions. And because of this, it is usually highlighted that climate change acts as a risk or threat multiplier, right? And this is a phrase that you'll see here like everywhere in the field. This school builds upon both quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods approaches overall, right? Next slide, please. So this research recognizes that climate change itself is rarely the direct cause of conflict, as I said, right? And so there is ample evidence that its effects exacerbate other important drivers and contextual factors of conflict and of fragility, right? And it thereby like challenges the stability of states and of societies. It usually presents its results to what it's called like the climate security pathways, right? These are the different causal paths through which the effects of climate change can increase the risk of instability. And there are 5 pathways recognized. I will go very briefly through each one. So next slide, please. The first is the local resource competition pathway, right? Climate change affects the access and availability of natural resources, and this can combine with a resource demand, an increase in resource demand and environmental degradation. These trends can exacerbate local competition over natural resources and can increase conflict and potentially escalate into violence, right? This is a particularly salient or important pathway when climate impacts occur in context of fragile and social, like institutional environments, right? Which make it difficult for people to resolve disputes over natural resources in a peaceful way. For example, the most frequently cited example in the literature are farmer-herder conflicts, mostly in the Sahel and East Africa, right? Other examples include the differences in access to water between local communities and extractive industries in Latin America, or the concentration of land in many regions across the world, including Southeast Asia, Africa, and all across Central America, right? Next slide, please. So climate change may also undermine the viability of agricultural livelihoods and thereby reducing what's called the opportunity cost of engaging in illegal activities, right? So the loss of livelihood also related to the occurrence of displacement and migration, in turn associated with security risks for people on the move. The most commonly cited example in the literature of this is the massive migration to urban areas in Syria after a drought around 2007, 2010, and then again 2011, which is thought to be related to the onset of the civil war. The role of migration is also very commonly cited in literature on Central America and on Western Africa and the Sahel, right? And this is like cross-border migration. Next slide, please. Increasing food prices due to reduced agricultural productivity and the disruption of supply chains because of the effects of climate change have also been found to be related specifically to political instability. So as food prices increase, people, especially in urban areas, are more likely to engage in protest. And this is most clearly reported related to the onset of the Arab Spring revolutions, right? About 10 years ago. Next slide, please. Extreme weather events and disasters, they can exacerbate fragility challenges and increase people's vulnerability and grievances, especially in contexts that have already been affected by conflict situations. So this is a specifically relevant pathway where there is already ongoing conflict. This reduces the capacity of the state to provide public services and protect people, and so undermines political legitimacy. Now, it's important to note also that, as we said before, the occurrence of disaster can just as likely reduce the intensity of conflict, right? So again, it really depends on the situation, and it's very contingent on the specific context whether disasters will go in any direction in terms of conflict, right? And next slide, please. For our 5th climate security pathway, they're related to the unintended consequences of climate action, right? Which have been cited as a source of conflict in themselves. This is not usually related to armed conflict, but rather to more localized forms of conflict over unequal distribution of benefits or access to resources. Most of the literature on these topics, they focus on the role of environmental conservation, on the production of biofuels, and the construction of dams for hydropower as contributors to conflict. The literature focuses basically everywhere in the world, but includes Latin America, Africa, Western Asia, and South and Southeast Asia, specifically focused on these 3 topics, right? And next slide, please. So I just wanted to present this. This is not part of the pathways that of the 5 pathways. It's a 6 pathways, right? Climate change also affects the shared transboundary natural resources. But I presented this as an extra pathways because it is the most controversial. So it says basically that reducing water availability challenges the cooperation between countries, in transboundary resources, which may increase competition, eventually potentially leading to conflict between countries, right? These studies relying on past data, they usually suggest that there are no examples of interstate war over shared water resources. This is why it's so controversial. But although this is a hopeful finding, which may suggest that it is not relevant to climate security, some researchers argue that, well, there is really no guarantee that cooperation will continue under increasing demands for water, while its ability reduces due to climate change, right? And so past and ongoing political conflicts over dams, they highlight these risks. Examples cited in the literature, they include the Nile, the Ganges, the Euphrates, Tigris, and the Mekong rivers as potential risks of this conflict, right? Next slide, please. I'm almost finishing here. So to go for our third research question, the human security, or the human dimensions, right? This literature mostly looks at how people actually experience these risks on the ground, mostly by looking at fieldwork research. Now, there is not a lot of fieldwork research done. In fact, if we go to the next slide, please. A very recent review found that there are only around 17 peer-review articles that are based on ethnographic and fieldwork research approaches. So we're really lacking here, like, the people's perspective on how are climate and conflict risks actually overlapping in everyday lives. But we can sort of, based on peer review and great literature reports, we can sort of start seeing some patterns, regional patterns of how this looks like, right? So in terms of Africa, which is the main focus of this literature, by the way, by far. Most of the publications are in Africa. They found that desertification and drought are the main environmental issues, especially in the Sahel, right? This erodes rural livelihoods, increasing poverty and food security, and thereby leading to increasing migration of farmers and pastoralists, again, which leads to competition over access to resources for pasture and water, right? Resource conflicts are also coupled with larger armed conflicts, right? And associated with insurgency groups through recruitment, such as Boko Haram, right? Or conflict in Somalia, for example. And conflict also leads to reduced adaptive capacities and competitions between migrants and refugees with local populations for resources. In South and Southeast Asia, weak governance and political institutions is the main, let's say, like, variable that the literature looks into. And its great climate threats have been associated in Southeast Asia to insurgency groups infiltrating and recruiting villagers, right? So another big thing in Asia is the urbanization. So increasing climate-related agrarian threats leads to more migration and urbanization, which then creates a lot of challenges due to disasters under conditions of instability and inadequate infrastructure, thereby undermining political legitimacy. In West Asia, it is drought and desertification that has been particularly challenging. Most of the literature focuses on the Arab Spring Revolution, especially in Syria, but there is other literature on Afghanistan and Pakistan, right, that it's also relevant for this. Here it's poor governance and political repression, but it's the focus of the literature, and especially focuses on migration into urban areas and how this creates processes of political instability or increases discontent over non-responsive or non-representative governments, right? And finally, Central and South America and the Caribbean. This is the by far the least explored region, right? And most of the literature is focused on Central America specifically, some in Colombia, but most of it in Central America. Here, the findings is that tropical storms and irregular rainfall patterns undermine resource availability, and conflicts over land and extractive industries, they increase because of this, right? So this is the main focus of the literature. Inter-community conflicts over water are also a very important thing here. And of course, the adoption of illegal activities related to drug cartels and of increasing irregular migration and the associated risks to people on the move. These are like the main focuses of the literature. And actually, that's it for me now. So this is like the human dimensions of climate security. And yeah, I will pass it on to Amanda for our next discussion.
Thanks, Leo. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. Great. So now we're going to talk about climate adaptation in particular and the relationship with conflict and conflict sensitivity. And this sort of builds on what we've been talking about with all the relationships between climate and conflict, and then what climate adaptation work in particular, what role it plays. And when we talk about climate adaptation, just to set the stage, we're talking about adjustments in systems, social, economic, ecological systems, or practices or activities that are in response to actual or expected climate changes or the effects of climate change. And so when you look at the literature about climate adaptation and conflict, you generally see two pathways. The first is a positive pathway where climate adaptation can reduce pressures that climate change causes. If it's a positive adaptation, it could minimize or address drivers of conflict, and even promote peace in some cases. And then alternatively, we have a negative pathway where poorly designed or maladaptive or basically not conflict sensitive adaptation work exacerbates the drivers of conflict. And there is some evidence in the literature that these negative pathways are more common. But as Leo mentioned, there's a lot of spaces where we don't have a comprehensive evidence base right now. We can go to the next slide. So if we're thinking about conflict sensitivity, that is the ability of an intervention or an organization to understand the context and the connections between the intervention or the work and the context, and then to act upon that understanding by both minimizing negative impacts or increasing conflict and maximizing positive impacts. And if you look at the literature, there are a lot of guidance documents on conflict-sensitive climate adaptation, including ones that provide guidance on doing impact assessments, for example. And if we share these slides, I can add on some of those resources with links, so if you want to explore them. However, there's actually very limited evaluations or evidence on what that means in practice, what conflict-sensitive climate adaptation looks like. And I've listed a few here that, as you can see, are all within the last 3 years, which is when a lot of this work has been done is more recently. There's one synthesis note that shows weak evidence of conflict sensitivity, and it specifically looked at climate adaptation work in Mali, Somalia, and Sudan. There's some German government guidelines on conflict sensitivity that were published in 2022 and are based on a very limited number of case studies. And those guidelines note, we need a more robust evidence base to really talk about good practice in this space. And then there's a 2023 evaluation of climate adaptation interventions that show a very limited promotion of conflict sensitive climate adaptation interventions. And so not only do we have limited evidence, the evidence that we have shows that climate adaptation generally is not taking a systematic approach to being conflict sensitive in these spaces. And that more evidence is really needed to develop good practices. If we go to the next slide. So you'll see my part of the presentation is a little bit faster because there's been so much work done in climate security, but we're really climate adaptation some, and now we're going to talk about climate finance, where there's been not that much work done to date either. So climate finance institutions are operating in countries that are affected by conflict, fragility, and violence. We know that. For example, the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, which is one of the UNFCCC's climate institutions, focus on least developed countries. That's one of their focus areas, half of which are conflict affected or considered to have high institutional or social fragility. And there have been various evaluations of GCF activities that show that these countries face longer negotiations and getting GCF funding and delays in programming. And there have been some findings that the GCF is considered to be somewhat inflexible in its processes for these countries that are facing a lot of climate related and conflict related. For the Global Environment Facility, a recent evaluation from 2020 found that a third of its portfolio is in countries affected by major armed conflict. And so even more of those countries are affected by different kinds of conflict, violent, nonviolent, and situations of fragility. And there have been numerous evaluations of the Jeff's work as well that show that this conflict context affects its work. But there's no official or institutional process in the Jeff for working in these contexts, although many of its implementing agencies have their own approaches to engaging in those contexts. The Adaptation Fund also works in very similar contexts, right? And its most recent strategy, the 2023 to 2027, makes a small note that it will continue to address challenges in these contexts, but there isn't a lot more than that in its strategy. And its 2022 evaluation policy also talks about human and ecological sustainability and security, and has a specific question about whether interventions are sensitive to conflict and fragility. And just want to mention the World Bank, because they've done a lot in this area too, with creating an FCV strategy, an action plan on climate change and resilience. And so there is work being done there too to figure out how do we engage in climate related work in these really vulnerable, fragile, conflict affected contexts. Go to the next slide. So in general, there isn't much evidence at all about climate finance institutions and their degree of conflict sensitivity. The evidence is mostly, working in these spaces of conflict. Climate finance institutions have challenges and they need to do X, Y, or Z. And so some of the recommendations that are pulled from the various evaluations and other literature is advising these institutions to develop guidance on conflict sensitivity for those that they give funding to, and even to develop special financing vehicles for conflict affected contexts, because the current modes of financing don't seem to be appropriate to conflict affected contexts. There's also a recommendation to do cross-fund training so that many of these financing institutions take a similar approach and it's less confusing and burdensome for those receiving funding. Ensuring risk aversity doesn't exclude the people that really need it from receiving climate finance. There have been findings in these evaluations that it's much harder for a country that is fragile but also experiencing climate effects to get funding, and they are the ones that need it the most. Harmonizing financial requirements, and that's across these funds, so that people don't have such a hard time, going to the GCF and going to the Adaptation Fund, and it's confusing and burdensome. And then leveraging platforms for learning. So how do we actually get the evidence about what's working and share it so that we can all use it and improve practices? So there really is very limited evidence on what this could look like, because there's not really an institutionalized approach to how these climate finance institutions can engage in these conflict affected spaces. Let me go to the next slide. We're going to talk through some of the gaps and challenges, and so I'll turn it back over to Leo for the climate security piece.
Thank you, Amanda. I'll just go super briefly through this so we can have the last 15 minutes for discussion. But there's many, but we are highlighting here 4 main gaps and challenges for the climate and security linkages knowledge base, right? Like, so how are these interlinkages actually unfolding in reality on the ground, right? First of all, there are no efforts to actually measure what are the relative or the conditional probabilistic importance of climate as opposed to non-climatic drivers of conflict, right? So it's very, very hard to tell, okay, what are, like, even when there is some form of relation, what is the actual contribution of climate change to ongoing or increasing escalation or de-escalation of conflict, right? There have been some attempts, but through quantitative approaches, but nobody has actually been able to answer this in a comprehensive way that convinces the research community. In relation to this also, because it's very hard to address it through complexity. So the second challenge is that although we have a sense of how these climate security pathways look like, we do not really know if we're accounting for everything, for the whole impact pathways and cascading risks that the direct effects of climate change may trigger over society. So there may be other forms, right? And there's specifically some gaps there on especially the human dimension of climate security, so how people actually experience this on the ground beyond actually armed conflict, which is the focus of the field. For example, by increasing crime, by reducing social capital between neighbors. All of these are risks of societal instability, right? By increasing gender-based violence within households, which is also something that continuously come up when you do field work. By reducing the chances of kids going to school and so thereby ending up in other forms of sometimes illegal modes of forms of income, right? All of these are pathways that have not been fully explored because they are not the traditional conflict focus, right, of the field. And so, yeah, there is a need to increase that. Then integrating the results from qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods approaches is very, very hard. I can tell you, for example, I work for an organization that has methods to understand it from econometric perspectives, network analysis through quantitative approaches. Then there is the field work done, which is like what I do within the team. There are the literature review people. All of these methods, they are there, but it's very, very hard to, okay, how do we create a comprehensive narrative that advises policy through all of them, right? Also because sometimes they're actually contradictory in the results. So it's very, very hard to do this. And especially relevant, there is no effort so far that have been comprehensive to actually like extrapolate the effects of climate change into the future and what does that mean for security risks, right? So all we can do now is look at the past instances of conflict, right? Ongoing effects of climate change and what does that mean towards situation right now. And then we can maybe make guesses, right? So this may, for example, with the transboundary water sheds, right? These may increase the risk of conflict or non-collaborative relations between states in the future, but we just don't know if it's going to happen, right? Because it's so contingent on many, many, many things. So the modeling into the future while accounting for future climate conditions, right? How is the availability of water going to be in 30 years in certain places? And what does that mean for the stability of this place? This is one of the biggest research questions in the field right now. Yeah. Over to you, Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks. And if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about some of the gaps and challenges for adaptation and finance. The first is what actually are the effective approaches for conflict-sensitive climate adaptation. So evaluating what really works. Again, as I mentioned, there's lots of guidance out there. There's these recommendations, but there really isn't a comprehensive assessment of what works and where and why. And relatedly, it's really important to understand these various structures of vulnerability in climate adaptation, right? Because we do know, especially in understanding the negative impacts of climate adaptation work, that those projects or interventions affect different people differently, depending on the political, economic, and cultural structures in a place. There's research that shows that those that are vulnerable can be really negatively affected by climate adaptation work. So that has to be also explored through additional evaluations or assessments or evidence gathering. And then the final part is institutional gaps in developing more adaptive approaches. So as I noted with these climate finance institutions, for the most part, there really isn't an approach to engaging in contexts of fragility, conflict, and violence. So not only do we need the evidence, we need people to actually implement approaches to engaging in these spaces through these institutions, so that we can then find, again, what works, what doesn't, in what context, under what circumstances, etc. And so pointing out those gaps and challenges and the research and evidence that's available that we found, as we mentioned a couple of times, we hope that this can be a bit of a conversation. So on the next slide, we have some questions, and we can share these for a moment. We'll go through them, and then hoping we can turn on cameras and have a conversation about first, what are we missing? And what we've shared today, what did we not capture, and the trends in the literature? What do you know that's ongoing or new? Maybe it hasn't been published yet. Maybe it's something you're working on or someone in your organization is working on that would shed some light on some of these gaps and challenges. Also, how should we generate evidence to address them? What are some promising or innovative approaches that we should focus on? Where should we generate the evidence? Leo showed where geographically there is evidence on climate security, but what geographical gaps do we have that we need to address, as well as what kind of programmatic gaps? He also mentioned, for example, that traditionally we tend to focus on conflict that looks a certain way. So should we be focusing on something else then? And then who should generate the evidence? What organization should play which roles? Whose responsibility is it? Who can really lead the charge? We would really love to hear about some of these questions from you and your experiences, and any other questions that you have and want to pose to the group. So maybe we will stop. Yep, there we go. Annika's on it. And if folks want to come on camera and come off mute, raise your hand, and think through any of those questions or any additional ones that you have or experiences you can share. Sasha.
Hi, hello. Do you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. That was super, super interesting. So I'm a graduate student at Columbia University, and I'm studying both energy and environmental policy, as well as conflict resolution. And I can confirm that even in classes, there are no bridge between the two fields. So this is really I really struggle to find this kind of evidence and this kind of interest, even if among my peers, it's really complicated. And so I was wondering, with all the research, are there something about climate mitigation as well? Can peace building operation and conflict resolution be used to mitigate climate change even before we're trying to adapt?
I haven't seen anything on that, but I would ask Leo or anyone else in the group if they have.
So from my side, there's some publications regarding the mitigating greenhouse gases in the military, right? It may be related to what you're asking, but it's not exactly what you're asking, right? So decarbonizing military operations, which is, for me, it's a whole ethical issue just to even ask that question. But okay, there's a big literature on this, on how can we actually avoid greenhouse gas emissions while doing war, right? Which is wow, okay. But yes, there is this regarding actual mitigation through peace building. No, regarding peace building through mitigation, there is some, right? There is some, for example, on the provision of public services through solar energy, right? And how can that increase state-society relations and political legitimacy to undermine? And there's some literature on this in Afghanistan, for example. But with very, very mixed results. So the provision of public services is another thing that it's still in well, we don't really know if it actually manages to build peace. Provision of environmental public services, such as energy, right? I would say mostly it takes this direction, the provision of solar energy as a public service, as a peace building strategy. But peace building as a mitigation strategy, I haven't seen anything about that.
And I should add too, I have seen work for example, funded by the Jeff, where they are doing ecosystem restoration in conflict affected areas. And those processes involve certain natural resource management mechanisms that could promote peace building or building of social cohesion, but a lot of times that objective isn't the focus, right? The focus is on ecosystem restoration or ecosystem conservation, and that's an area where I think further research could really help address that gap as well. And Peter did put something in the chat too. Natalia, I did see your hand up, but I think it's down. I don't know if you still wanted to.
Thanks, Amanda, for the presentation and for calling on me. My question was very similar in terms of, can energy projects, and in mind I have, has anyone looked at geothermal? I'm looking at the Balkans in particular that produce so much coal and are very dependent on a source of energy that's very detrimental to climate mitigation efforts. So if there were to be a regional energy grid, hypothetically, this could help build social cohesion, integration of the economies within the region, while also addressing climate mitigation. But this is a hypothetical. How do you study a hypothetical? And is anyone looking at that?
It's a good question. Yeah,
Go
Leo?
ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Again, most of it is in renewable energy as solar power, but I saw at some point a geothermal project in Kenya that was discussed from the other side. Like, it actually sparked conflict because of unequal distribution of benefits. So this is the most important one. But there are some, again, and all of these are like policy briefs in which geothermal is discussed as part of a decentralization of energy production strategy that can potentially contribute to peace. All, in my view, from purely like this is the theory of change, right? Actual projects that have used geothermal energy to build peace and actually measured and evaluated their efforts, I would need to look among the very many case studies in the Environmental Peacebuilding Association's publications, but I haven't seen it, to be honest.
And that's a good reference too, that the Environmental Peacebuilding Association does keep a very comprehensive library of documents and other resources that could be useful. And I think sometimes the challenge is that what we might call environmental peacebuilding, or, you know, something related, people may be doing work like that, but they're not calling it that. And so it's harder to have a conversation. Is there anyone else I know we've seen some things in the chat, but anyone else that can respond to that question? Got some good resources in the chat.
I just realized that I'm messaging only to you, Amanda, instead of everybody. I've been putting some comments in. Sorry, I'll start messaging everybody now.
Definitely paste those in.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm curious if anybody here, I can put it back up. Oh, and great, thanks. We have some more people posting in the chat. I'm curious if anybody here, especially on the two slides around gaps, I'm curious if anybody is aware of studies or literature or, I don't know, projects that sort of fill those gaps. And if it's helpful, I can put those slides back up. But that was actually one of my questions kind of coming into the session overall. I mean, Amanda and Leo are clearly experts, but I'm also curious, what is it that we don't know? Because part of the effort of these types of convenings and bringing people together is also just trying to exchange and discover the depths of, where we don't know things. So great, this is helpful. People throwing stuff in the chat, but does anybody is it helpful if I put the slide, maybe I'll put it back up with the two gaps on them. But I'm curious if anybody has any examples in those gaps. So here's one. I won't go full screen.
See that Nimke posted a very interesting comment on waste management as peace building. It's not exactly climate action, but also sort of like it can be considered a resilience building. And I actually find it very interesting, because I find personally that solid waste management is a very, very underexplored topic in the environmental peace building field. I've seen, for example, in Mindanao, in my field, I saw huge opportunity to do this that weren't being actually even explored by anybody. So Yeah, I don't know, Nick, if you maybe I don't know if I'm even pronouncing your name correctly. Apologize if I'm not, but maybe you can actually tell us a little bit more about this Yemen project that you're mentioning.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I don't know much about it because it's a partner that we work with for other topics. And sorry, I have an echo, so it's hard to concentrate. I will type, sorry.
No worries. And please do put it in the chat. I know it's sort of a nightmare to hear yourself talking. I'm also trying to find another example who has done a community of practice member who's done waste management, environmental peace building projects in Kyrgyzstan. So I'll try to find a link for that as well. Marina.
I'm afraid I won't be able to fulfill the gap or have a knowledge of where the gaps are, like the gaps can be answered. And it does seem to me that the field is more filled with gaps than it is with a lot of knowledge, but I'm kind of trying to gauge people's opinions on the local knowledge because we've discussed before how to use hypotheticals perhaps as a scientific method, if at all. And one thing that came up for us when we did research in Southern Africa on climate security is the idea of integrating local knowledge into the processes, right? Because some of the indicators of the relationship between climate change and conflict that came up from local peace builders were like looking at how birds are flying. And if birds are flying in a very particular way, that is an indicator to the local communities that, you know, their community may be at risk from, you know, invaders, etc., etc. So what I was wondering is if one of the opportunity for us is not only kind of continue pursuing the very much scientific and heavily reliant on quantitative data type of information, but also be able in some way to contribute and normalize kind of hypothetical and local knowledge that is based on word-to-word kind of passing of information as a scientific evidence. So I do not know if more work has been done by anyone, but it would be great to hear your perspective on how best to integrate local knowledge in these processes.
I would love to hear from other people that have seen that, but I think that is a really important point, Marina, where we see people are focused at one level. And I think Leo talked a bit about this, like it's the national level or it's the local level, and there's not a lot of or it's quantitative or qualitative, and there's not a lot of but I don't know if anyone has, Leo or you or others have examples of this being done well, or at least tried. I mean, part of this is that we need to share what we tried, even if it didn't work, so that we can build on that knowledge and move forward. But I'd love to hear if anyone has anything on that.
I think we're identifying more gaps, aren't we? Or identifying not only more gaps, but also more sort of just orientational approach kind of gaps in a way. Sorry, Leo, I think I interrupted you.
The Everyday Peace Indicators project may be quite relevant to your question, Marina. I think I particularly love it. It's an approach to actually define peace based on, well, what people consider to be stability. Some of these indicators, for example, include peace means dogs not barking in the night, because that means that nothing is happening that you should be afraid of, right? And when you do more ethnographic or at least fieldwork based research, you start finding like how do people actually measure peace in their own terms, right? And by identifying this, you can then really build upon like ideas for interventions that support specifically this kind of thing. I see Hector Morales' work being mentioned from Adelphi. He's actually part of my research center also in South. We're colleagues in the PhD. Also, I'm doing my PhD. So his work is a great example on Colombia and in other contexts, right? In which, okay, how do you actually understand what environmental peace building is from below? And usually what this means is that interventions, and I think Amanda mentioned it, interventions need to really build upon the political economy approach and really recognize, okay, what are those structures of vulnerability or sources of vulnerability that act as structural drivers, right? Either cultural, political, economic, right? Intersectional and gender. And I think this is where the field is in general going. Like, you need to design your conflict sensitive intervention by accounting for these specific things that come up for this village, for this community, for this context. Otherwise, you're at risk of messing things up, right? But yeah, sorry, Claire, I see you have your hands up.
Hi everyone, lots of familiar faces. Yeah, I mean, you asked the question about gaps, Annika, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this because one of the hardest things that we had to do on the Environment of Peace program was try and find examples and feel confident in those examples as we sort of put forward the evidence. And I think one of the challenges is that where we have more examples of things that are working or trying to address kind of this dual conflict environmental kind of crises, but often they're still kind of stories and they're one-offs, or they're kind of pilots, or they're something which, and we don't really, what I feel is missing is that we're not quite there yet. You know, it's all very context specific, and it's like, well, what does someone take away from that that's not working in that context? And so I guess it's kind of not just what is working, but also kind of why is it working, and how is that kind of, because basically when I present the Environment of Peace to any policymaker, the first question is, okay, what does it look like? What do I need to do? So they kind of want to immediately jump to the kind of well, can you just give me an example that I can like plug into my programming system? And that it's not so easy, but I don't think we sufficiently have got to the point where we're saying, okay, so we know these sort of things work in these different contexts, and what's common between them are these things. And if you take some of those things with you into your programming, that might have a higher likelihood of success. But even so, you need to think about it in the specific context and understand the specific conflict dynamics. So it's that kind of thing, like how can we make the evidence helpful to other people when things are so context specific?
We're almost at time, and I've put the link to, actually, if you want to hear more from Claire and her colleagues, they'll be hosting a webinar in this series on the 16th of November. I know we said that it's a bi-weekly webinar series, but we've sort of thrown out the bi-weekly because the Geneva Peace Week will be held the first week of November. So we'll exceptionally hold one next week as well. I've put those in the chat along with the link, but before, I actually don't want to be the one to close this out. I don't know, Amanda or Leo, if you want to just provide any sort of closing word, putting a chapeau on the conversation. Can I hand over to one of you?
Sure. I guess I'll just say thank you all for coming and for some great questions and sharing some really great resources. I've captured a few that I think will be really helpful. And I hope that you all will find ways to stay in touch so we can explore some of these issues, whether that's through ECCP or the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and its M&E interest group. But I think, you know, as long as we keep talking and keep sharing and keep asking questions and keep sharing even when we are failing or not doing great, we can make a lot of progress in this area. So thank you all so much for attending. We really appreciate your participation and feedback.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks, Leo, for your expertise. This has been brilliant and so helpful. Have a great day, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording now.